Karen Mitchell stood in her backyard at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, coffee mug trembling in her manicured hands, staring at what could only be described as an ecological disaster, where her beloved creek had babbled peacefully for the past 15 years, the same creek that had sold her on this house, the same creek she'd spent thousands landscaping around, now sat a concrete dam with a brass plaque that read, Willowbrook HOA Beautification Project 2024. Those absolute. She caught herself before the profanity escaped, though there wasn't another soul around to hear it. Karen prided herself on maintaining standards, even in moments of rage. The creek, which had flowed from the mountains behind Willowbrook Estates down through her property and into the community's ornamental ponds, was now blocked by what appeared to be a hastily constructed but permanent barrier. The water had backed up into a stagnant pool, already attracting mosquitoes and emitting a smell that made Karen's nose wrinkle. She pulled out her phone and speed-dialed the HOA office. Willowbrook Homeowners Association, this is Brenda. Brenda, this is Karen Mitchell at 1247 Sycamore Lane. What exactly is this concrete monstrosity in my backyard? Oh, Mrs. Mitchell, good morning. You must be calling about the beautification project. The board voted last month to redirect the water flow for aesthetic purposes. The creek was deemed rustic. Karen's eye twitched. Rustic? Yes, ma'am. The new president, Mrs. Vandenberg, felt the natural creek detracted from the community's upscale image. The water now flows through underground pipes directly to our fountain feature at the clubhouse. And nobody thought to inform the homeowner whose property this affects? Well, technically, the creek runs through the common easement that extends 10 feet into each bordering property. It's all in the HOA covenants you signed when you purchased. Karen ended the call without another word, her mind already racing. She'd been the HOA president herself for 3 years, until last spring's election, when that pretentious newcomer Vivian Vandenberg had somehow convinced enough residents that Karen was too aggressive in her leadership style. The irony wasn't lost on her. 20 minutes later, Karen was dressed in her best power suit, navy blue Armani with the jacket that made her shoulders look broader, and marching through the automatic doors of the HOA office like a woman on a mission. I need to see the board meeting minutes from last month, she announced to Brenda, who looked up nervously from her computer. Mrs. Mitchell, those are available online in the resident portal. I want the physical copies now. Brenda scurried to a filing cabinet and produced a manila folder. Karen flipped through the pages, her anger mounting with each line she read. The vote had been unanimous. Vandenberg plus 4 other board members Karen barely knew, all recent transplants to the community. Where's the environmental impact assessment? Karen asked. The what? The environmental impact assessment. Surely you didn't just dam a natural waterway without consulting environmental agencies. Brenda's blank stare was answer enough. Karen smiled for the first time that morning, though it wasn't particularly warm. I see. And where might I find Mrs. Vandenberg this morning? She's usually at the clubhouse around 9 for her yoga class. Karen glanced at her Rolex. 8:43 a.m. Perfect. The Willowbrook Estates clubhouse was a monument to suburban excess, all gleaming marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the artificially enhanced landscape. Karen found Vivian Vandenberg in the main yoga studio, positioned perfectly in front of the mirror wall, leading a class of 6 other women through what appeared to be warrior pose. Breathe into the stretch, ladies. Feel your connection to the earth. Karen bit back a laugh at the irony and waited in the doorway until the session ended. As the other women filtered out, chatting about their weekend plans, Vivian finally noticed her. Karen? What a pleasant surprise. I didn't know you were interested in yoga? I'm interested in environmental law, actually, specifically the Clean Water Act. Vivian's smile faltered slightly. I'm sorry? The creek you dammed yesterday. It's a natural waterway that flows year-round. which makes it protected under federal law. Did you obtain permits from the Army Corps of Engineers before you built your concrete wall? The creek is on HOA property. Part of it is. Part of it flows through private property, mine specifically, and all of it is subject to federal environmental protection. Karen pulled out her phone and showed Vivian a screenshot of an EPA website. Unauthorized alteration of natural waterways can result in fines up to $25,000 per day plus restoration costs. How many days has your dam been in place? Vivian's face had gone pale beneath her yoga glow. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. I've already filed a complaint with the regional EPA office. They should be in touch within the week. You can't do this over a little landscaping project. Karen's smile turned sharp. Watch me. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Vivian? You might want to check your insurance policy. I doubt it covers federal environmental violations. As Karen walked back to her car, she felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. This was just the beginning. Vivian Vandenberg had picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. But as she drove home, Karen's satisfaction began to curdle into something more complex. Through her rearview mirror, she could see the clubhouse growing smaller, and with it, the community she'd helped build and shape for over a decade. These people had been her friends, her neighbors. Some had even been close to her when her husband passed away 3 years ago. Now they felt like strangers. Worse, they felt like enemies. The creek dam was still there when she arrived home, as immutable as ever. Karen stood at her kitchen window, watching the stagnant water and thinking. The EPA complaint was real. She'd filed it from her car, but government agencies moved slowly. In the meantime, her creek remained blocked. Her property value was suffering. And Vivian Vandenberg was probably calling an emergency board meeting to figure out how to handle her. Karen opened her laptop and began researching. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, she'd show them exactly what that looked like. 3 hours later, she'd identified something interesting. The creek that flowed through her property didn't just originate in the mountains behind the development. It was fed by a natural spring that sat on a 5-acre parcel of undeveloped land directly uphill from Willowbrook Estates. Land that, according to county records, had been quietly purchased 6 months ago by someone with the initials K.M. Karen Mitchell had bought that land as an investment, back when she was still HOA president and thinking about the community's long-term development plans. She'd forgotten about it entirely until now. She grabbed her car keys and headed for the door. Time for a site inspection. The spring was exactly where she remembered it, a crystal-clear pool about 20 feet across, fed by underground sources and overflowing into the creek that eventually reached Willowbrook. Karen knelt beside the water, studying the natural rock formation that channeled the flow downstream. It would be surprisingly easy to redirect. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Janet. Emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7. Heard your name mentioned. Thought you should know. Karen smiled, watching the spring water bubble up from deep underground. She had 6 hours to prepare, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. Karen arrived at the emergency HOA meeting 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing her most professional smile. The clubhouse conference room was already buzzing with tension. She could feel it the moment she walked through the door. Vivian Vandenberg sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by the 4 other board members: Bob Patterson, a retired engineer; Susan Chen, a real estate agent; Marcus Williams, who owned a local marketing firm; and Dorothy Fitzgerald, whose main qualification seemed to be agreeing with whatever Vivian suggested. Karen, Vivian said, her voice carefully neutral. Thank you for joining us. Wouldn't miss it. Karen took a seat directly across from Vivian, setting her portfolio on the table with deliberate precision. About 30 residents had gathered in the rows of chairs behind the board table, more than Karen had seen at a meeting in years. Word traveled fast in a community like theirs. Vivian called the meeting to order and immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about frivolous complaints and community harmony. Karen listened with amusement, noting how Vivian carefully avoided mentioning the EPA or environmental law. The beautification project was approved by a unanimous board vote, Vivian concluded. We followed all proper procedures. Actually, Karen said, standing smoothly, I'd like to address that claim. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Several residents leaned forward in their chairs. The floor recognizes Karen Mitchell. Bob. Patterson said, consulting his copy of Robert's Rules. Karen opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. I've spent the day reviewing federal environmental regulations, and I'm afraid the board made several significant errors. She began distributing copies to the audience. First, any alteration to a natural waterway requires permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. Second, the Clean Water Act specifically prohibits blocking natural water flow without proper environmental impact studies. Vivian's jaw tightened. The creek runs through HOA easement property. Partially. It also runs through my private property, and more importantly, it's a natural waterway that flows year-round, which brings it under federal jurisdiction regardless of property lines. Karen pulled out her phone and projected an image onto the room's smart screen, a map showing the creek's path from the mountains, through her property, and into the community's water features. The EPA considers this an unauthorized dam. As of this morning, the HOA is in violation of federal environmental law. The room erupted in whispers and concerned voices. Karen raised her hand for quiet. But I'm not here just to point out problems. I'm here to offer solutions. She clicked to the next slide, a detailed restoration plan she'd spent the afternoon creating. Option 1. The board removes the dam immediately and restores natural flow. The EPA has indicated they'll consider this sufficient remediation if it's completed within 30 days. And option 2? Vivian asked, though she looked like she already dreaded the answer. Karen smiled. Option 2. You leave the dam in place and face daily fines of up to $25,000, plus potential criminal charges for willful violation of federal environmental law. The room fell silent. Dorothy Fitzgerald looked like she might faint. This is extortion, Vivian said. This is environmental law, Karen replied evenly. I didn't create these regulations. I'm just making sure everyone understands them. Bob Patterson cleared his throat. Karen, we appreciate your diligence in researching this issue, but surely we can find a compromise that maintains the aesthetic improvements while addressing your concerns. The aesthetic improvements, Karen said, consist of blocking a natural creek and creating a stagnant breeding ground for mosquitoes and bacteria. I'm not sure what aesthetic you're going for, but it isn't working. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. Marcus Williams leaned forward. What exactly would restoration involve? Karen clicked to the next slide. A detailed cost breakdown she'd obtained from 3 different contractors that afternoon. Removing the concrete dam, restoring the natural creek bed, and replanting native vegetation along the banks. Total cost, approximately $47,000. The room erupted again. Several residents stood up, talking loudly over each other. $47,000, Dorothy exclaimed. The entire beautification project only cost $30,000. The restoration costs more because you have to undo damage to a natural system, Karen explained calmly. It's always more expensive to fix environmental problems than to avoid them in the first place. Vivian banged her gavel, calling for order. We need time to research these claims and consult with our attorney. Of course, Karen said. Take all the time you need. Just keep in mind that EPA fines accrue daily. As the meeting devolved into chaos, with residents demanding explanations and board members trying to deflect responsibility, Karen quietly packed up her portfolio. She'd accomplished exactly what she'd come to do, put the fear of federal government into the HOA board and make it clear that she wasn't going to roll over. But as she walked to her car, Karen felt the familiar hollow ache that had become her constant companion since her husband's death. This wasn't how she'd imagined spending her retirement years, at war with her own community over a creek in her backyard. The next morning, Karen woke to the sound of heavy machinery. She looked out her bedroom window to see a crew of workers setting up equipment near the dam site. Her phone rang before she could even put on her robe. "Mrs. Mitchell? This is Jim Rodriguez from Rodriguez Excavation. We're here to remove some concrete structure, but the homeowner isn't answering her door." "I'm the homeowner," Karen said, suddenly very awake. "But I didn't hire you." "Ma'am, we have a work order from—" She could hear papers rustling. "Willowbrook HOA. They said it was an emergency environmental remediation." Karen laughed, despite herself. Apparently, her EPA threat had been more effective than she'd anticipated. "Hold on, I'll be right down." She threw on jeans and a sweater and headed outside, where she found Jim and his crew standing around looking confused. "The thing is," Jim explained, "this isn't just a simple demolition. This concrete was poured around some kind of steel framework, and it looks like there are utility lines running through it. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we start breaking things." Karen studied the dam more closely. In daylight, she could see that it was more complex than she'd initially realized. There were indeed pipes and electrical conduits embedded in the concrete. "What kind of utilities?" she asked. "Looks like water and electrical. Maybe fiber optic. Cable too." A terrible suspicion began forming in Karen's mind. "Jim, do you know where these lines lead?" He pointed downstream toward the community clubhouse and maintenance buildings. "Looks like they run to the main facilities." Karen pulled out her phone and called the HOA office. "Brenda, it's Karen Mitchell. Quick question. Where does the clubhouse get its water supply?" "From the municipal line, I think." "Why?" "And the backup system?" "Backup system?" "The well system that was installed 2 years ago when we had those water pressure issues." There was a pause. "Oh, that system. I think it draws from— Oh no. From the creek, right? The creek that's now blocked by your dam." "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to talk." 20 minutes later, Vivian Vandenberg arrived at Karen's house looking decidedly less composed than she had the night before. She was followed by Bob Patterson and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the HOA's attorney. "We may have a problem," the attorney said without preamble. Karen invited them into her living room, enjoying the irony of the situation. "Would you like some coffee? I have excellent water pressure." Vivian didn't appreciate the humor. "Our backup water system draws from the creek upstream of where we built the dam. We didn't realize—" "You didn't realize that blocking your water source would cut off your water supply?" Karen asked. "Bob, you're an engineer." Bob looked miserable. "I wasn't involved in the planning process. If I had been—" "The point is," the attorney interrupted, "we need to resolve this situation quickly. The clubhouse facilities are already experiencing reduced water pressure, and if the backup system fails entirely, you'll have no water for the clubhouse, the pool system, or the irrigation for the common areas," Karen finished. "Yes, I can see how that would be a problem." "We're prepared to remove the dam immediately," Vivian said. "Are you?" Karen asked. "Because I've been thinking about this situation, and I'm not sure immediate removal is the best solution." The three visitors exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" the attorney asked carefully. Karen stood and walked to her window, looking out at the stagnant pool that had once been her creek. "The thing is, this whole situation has made me realize something. The creek doesn't just run through my property, it originates on my property." "That's not correct," Vivian said. "The creek comes from the mountains." "The creek is fed by a natural spring that sits on a 5-acre parcel I own upstream of this development." Karen turned back to face them. "Technically, all the water that flows through this community comes from my land. The color drained from the attorney's face. "Are you saying you could cut off the water supply entirely?" Karen smiled. "I'm saying I've been researching water rights law. It's fascinating reading." She pulled out a folder and handed each of them a document. "Colorado follows the prior appropriation doctrine for water rights. Since I own these so..." Karen woke up on Thursday morning to the sound of her doorbell ringing insistently. She glanced at the clock, 6:15 a.m., and sighed. In her experience, nobody brought good news before 7 in the morning. She pulled on her robe and padded to the front door, where she found 3 men in official-looking uniforms standing on her porch. The one in front held up a badge. "Mrs. Mitchell? I'm Inspector Dave Hawkins with the Colorado Division of Water Resources. We need to talk." Karen's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course. Would you like to come in?" 20 minutes later, she was sitting at her kitchen table across from Inspector Hawkins, while his 2 colleagues examined documents at the counter. She'd made coffee, partly out of politeness and partly to buy herself time to think. "Ma'am, we received a complaint yesterday alleging that you're threatening to unlawfully divert water from an established community supply. That's a serious charge." "From whom?" Karen asked, though she already knew. "The Willowbrook HOA. They claim you're attempting to extort them using false claims about water rights." Karen set down her coffee cup carefully. "Inspector, do you see that concrete dam in my backyard?" Hawkins glanced out the window. "Yes, ma'am. The HOA built that 3 days ago without any permits, blocking a natural creek that flows through my property. When I complained, they told me it was for aesthetic reasons." She stood and pulled out the same folder she'd shown the board members. "I've researched Colorado water law extensively. The creek originates from a spring on property I own upstream. Under prior appropriation doctrine, I have senior water rights." One of the other inspectors looked up from his documents. "Ma'am, do you have documentation of your beneficial use dating back to when you established these rights?" Karen felt her confidence waver slightly. "Beneficial use? Under Colorado law, you can't just own water rights by owning the land where water originates. You have to demonstrate continuous beneficial use: agriculture, domestic supply, commercial operations. Something that shows you've been actually using the water for a legitimate purpose. I've been using it for landscape irrigation in my pond system since I bought the property 15 years ago." "Do you have records of that usage? Irrigation permits, landscape plans, anything that documents your water appropriation?" Karen realized. She was walking into legal quicksand. "Not specific permits, no." Inspector Hawkins closed his notebook. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to be straight with you. Water rights law is complex, and making threats about cutting off water supplies without proper legal standing can get you into serious trouble. Federal trouble, if it affects interstate commerce or public health. But surely I have some rights to water that flows through my property. You have rights to reasonable use of water that flows past your property, but you can't just dam it up or redirect it without going through the proper legal channels. And threatening to do so..." He shrugged. "Well, that's what we're here to investigate." After the inspectors left, Karen sat at her kitchen table feeling deflated and more than a little scared. She'd been so confident in her research, but apparently water rights law was even more complicated than environmental law. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Janet Kowalski, her neighbor from across the street. "Karen, honey, are you okay? I saw the state trucks in your driveway." "I'm fine, Janet. Just some regulatory questions about the creek situation. Listen, I'm calling because there's something you should know. Vivian's been going door to door, talking to people about you." Karen's stomach tightened. "What's she saying?" "She's telling everyone that you're trying to cut off water to the community facilities. Says you're going to shut down the pool and the clubhouse just to get your way about some landscaping." "It's not landscaping, it's my creek." "I know, honey, I know. But she's got people scared. Mrs. Henderson is worried about her grandkids not being able to use the pool this summer. The Patel family thinks you're going to drive down property values." Karen closed her eyes. "Janet, The HOA created this mess by damming the creek without permits. I'm just trying to get them to fix it properly. I understand that, but perception is reality in a place like this. And right now, people are seeing you as the problem. After Janet hung up, Karen poured herself another cup of coffee and tried to think strategically. She'd won the environmental law argument, but the water rights issue was more complicated than she'd realized. And now Vivian was turning the community against her by painting her as some kind of water-hoarding villain. She needed help. Real, professional help. 2 hours later, Karen was sitting in the offices of Brennan & Associates, Environmental Law, across from a sharp-eyed attorney named Rebecca Brennan, who specialized in water rights disputes. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've gotten yourself into quite a situation," Rebecca said after reviewing Karen's documents. "So I'm learning. The water resources inspector made it clear that I can't just threaten to cut off the community's water supply." "No, you can't. But that doesn't mean you don't have options." Rebecca pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a diagram. "The key issue here is that the HOA has created an unauthorized obstruction in a natural waterway. That's a clear violation of both state and federal law." "Right. That's what I told them. But instead of focusing on your water rights, which are questionable, we need to focus on their violations. The EPA complaint you filed is solid. The lack of permits is a problem they can't ignore. And the fact that they're now experiencing water supply issues because of their own dam is, well, it's poetic justice." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to file an emergency injunction requiring immediate removal of the dam based on environmental violations. We're also going to demand restoration costs and compensation for your property damage. What about the water rights issue? We'll make a good faith claim to established usage rights while acknowledging that a formal water court proceeding might be necessary to settle the issue definitively. But here's the thing. That process takes years, and in the meantime, the dam has to come down." Karen felt her confidence returning. "How long will this take?" "Emergency injunction could be heard within a week. The HOA's attorney will probably try to negotiate before it gets that far." As Karen drove home, she felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in days. She had a plan, she had professional legal help, and she was back on solid legal ground. But her optimism evaporated when she turned onto her street and saw the crowd gathered on the sidewalk in front of her house. There were maybe 20 people, standing on the public sidewalk, holding handmade signs with messages like, "Water is a community resource," and "Stop the selfish water grab." At the center of the group stood Vivian Vandenberg, holding a megaphone. Karen parked in her driveway and walked toward her front door, trying to ignore the crowd. "There she is," Vivian announced through the megaphone. "The woman who wants to cut off water to our children's swimming pools." "That's not what I'm doing," Karen called back, but her voice was lost in the murmur of the crowd. An elderly man Karen recognized from the community center stepped forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, is it true you're trying to shut down the clubhouse?" "Mr. Garrett, the HOA built an illegal dam that blocked my creek. I'm simply asking them to remove it and follow environmental law." "But what about our water supply?" asked a woman with 2 young children in tow. "The HOA's water supply problems are caused by their own dam, not by anything I'm doing." "That's not what we heard," Vivian said, her voice carrying clearly through the megaphone. "We heard you threatened to redirect the spring away from our community." Karen felt the crowd's mood shifting from curiosity to hostility. Several people were now holding up their phones, recording the confrontation. "I researched my legal options," Karen said. "That doesn't mean I'm going to cut off anyone's water." "But you could, couldn't you?" pressed another neighbor. "You could just decide one day that you don't like how we voted in the last HOA election and turn off our water." "That's not—" Karen started, but the crowd was getting louder, more agitated. A teenage boy she didn't recognize shouted from the back, "What kind of person threatens to cut off water to a whole neighborhood?" The situation was spiraling out of control. Karen looked around at faces that had once been friendly, people who had brought casseroles when her husband died, neighbors who had waved from their gardens. Now they looked at her with suspicion and anger. "I'm going inside," she announced, walking toward her front door. "Running away won't solve this problem," Vivian called after her through the megaphone. Karen paused with her hand on the doorknob. Something in Vivian's tone, smug, triumphant, made her turn around. "You're right, Vivian. Running away won't solve this problem. But neither will lying to our neighbors about what's actually happening here." She walked back toward the crowd, and the sidewalk grew quiet. 3 days ago, you built an illegal dam that blocked a natural creek running through my property. You didn't get permits, you didn't do environmental studies, and you didn't even bother to inform me that you were destroying a water feature that I've maintained for 15 years. Her voice was carrying now, clear and strong. "When I pointed out that your dam violates federal environmental law, you tried to have me investigated by the state water authority. When that didn't work, you organized this little demonstration to..." The law offices of Patterson, Chen and Associates occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the mountains. Karen arrived 10 minutes early for the settlement meeting, dressed in her most authoritative business suit and carrying a briefcase that had belonged to her late husband. She was surprised to find herself alone in the conference room with just Rebecca Brennan and a paralegal. "Where is everyone?" "They're running late," Rebecca said, checking her phone. "Apparently there was some last-minute discussion among the HOA board members." 20 minutes later, the conference room door opened and 5 people filed in. Vivian Vandenberg, looking significantly less composed than usual, the HOA's attorney David Chen, and 3 board members Karen didn't immediately recognize. Notably, absent were Bob Patterson and Dorothy Fitzgerald. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for agreeing to meet," David Chen said as they took seats across the polished mahogany table. "My clients are hoping we can reach a mutually beneficial resolution to this situation." "Where's the rest of the board?" Karen asked. Vivian's jaw tightened. "Bob and Dorothy felt there might be a conflict of interest, given their previous working relationship with you." Karen suppressed a smile. Translation: they'd probably told Vivian she was on shaky legal ground and wanted no part of what was about to happen. "Well then," Rebecca said, opening her folder, "let's get started. My client's position is straightforward. The unauthorized dam must be removed immediately, the natural creek flow must be restored, and the HOA must pay for environmental remediation and damages to Mrs. Mitchell's property." "Our position," David Chen replied, "is that the beautification project was approved through proper HOA procedures and that Mrs. Mitchell's complaints are an attempt to circumvent the community's democratic decision-making process." Rebecca pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Mr. Chen, are you familiar with Section 402 of the Clean Water Act?" "Of course, and with the Army Corps of Engineers regulations regarding unauthorized alterations to navigable waters?" David's confidence seemed to waver slightly. "The creek in question is hardly navigable. Any natural waterway that flows year-round and connects to navigable waters falls under federal jurisdiction. Your clients built a concrete dam across such a waterway without any permits whatsoever." Rebecca slid a document across the table. "This is the EPA's preliminary finding. They've classified the dam as an unauthorized discharge of fill material into waters of the United States. The recommended penalty is $25,000 per day, retroactive to the date of construction." Karen watched the color drain from Vivian's face as David Chen scanned the document. "Furthermore," Rebecca continued, "the Colorado Division of Water Resources has determined that the dam interferes with established downstream water rights, which creates additional state-level violations." "This is all very technical," Vivian interjected, "but the practical reality is that we have a community of 200 families who voted for this improvement project. Are you really going to let one person's complaints override the will of the entire neighborhood?" Karen leaned forward. "Vivian, the will of the neighborhood doesn't supersede federal environmental law. You can't vote to violate the Clean Water Act any more than you can vote to ignore murder statutes. That's a ridiculous comparison, is it? Because the EPA takes unauthorized environmental damage very seriously. Ask the developers in Phoenix, who thought they could fill in a desert wash without permits. They're still paying fines 5 years later. David Chen cleared his throat. Perhaps we could discuss compromise positions. What if we modified the existing structure rather than removing it entirely? Rebecca shook her head. Any permanent alteration to the natural waterway requires the same federal permits your clients don't have. The only legally compliant option is complete removal and restoration. And what about Mrs. Mitchell's threat to cut off our water supply? Asked Marcus Williams, speaking up for the first time. Karen had been dreading this question. I researched my legal options regarding water rights. That doesn't constitute a threat. But you did tell the board you could redirect the spring away from our community, Vivian pressed. I said I owned the source property and had researched prior appropriation doctrine. I never said I was going to cut off anyone's water. Rebecca intervened smoothly. My client's water rights are a separate legal matter that would need to be adjudicated in water court if the parties can't reach agreement. But that's not what we're here to discuss today. David Chen made a note on his legal. Pat, what exactly are your client's demands for settlement? Rebecca consulted her own notes. First, immediate removal of the unauthorized dam. Second, restoration of natural creek flow and native vegetation. Third, compensation for property damage and lost property value. And fourth, a written agreement ensuring that no future alterations to the waterway will be made without proper permits and Mrs. Mitchell's consent. And in exchange, Mrs. Mitchell will withdraw her EPA complaint and won't pursue additional damages for the period the dam has been in place. Vivian laughed harshly. So we pay tens of thousands of dollars to undo our improvement project, and in exchange, Karen graciously agrees not to sue us for even more money? The alternative, Rebecca said calmly, is that the EPA proceeds with their enforcement action. You face daily fines until the violation is corrected, and Mrs. Mitchell pursues separate damages in civil court. Your choice. The HOA representatives huddled together for several minutes, whispering urgently. Karen could catch fragments of the conversation, insurance coverage, special assessment, recall election. Finally, David Chen looked up. We need time to present this to the full board and consult with our insurance carrier. How much time? Rebecca asked. 2 weeks. You have 72 hours, Rebecca countered. The EPA complaint remains active and fines are accruing daily. Every day you delay costs your clients another $25,000. As the meeting broke up, Karen felt cautiously optimistic. The HOA's legal position was clearly weaker than they'd initially believed, and the prospect of mounting federal fines was obviously concerning them. But as she walked to the elevator with Rebecca, Vivian caught up with them. Karen, can we speak privately for a moment? Rebecca looked questioningly at Karen, who nodded. I'll meet you downstairs. When they were alone in the hallway, Vivian's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. This is insane. You're going to destroy this community over a creek in your backyard. I didn't create this situation, Vivian. You did when you decided to build an illegal dam without consulting anyone. It wasn't illegal when we built it. We followed all the HOA procedures. HOA procedures don't override federal environmental law. You should have researched that before you started pouring concrete. Vivian's eyes flashed with anger. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always did, even when you were HOA president. Always had to have the last word. Always had to be right about everything. Karen felt a familiar stab of pain. This was getting personal in a way that went beyond the creek dispute. This isn't about being right, she said quietly. It's about my property and my rights as a homeowner. It's about control. It's always been about control with you. When you were president, you micromanaged every decision, every committee, every social event. People were relieved when you stepped down. The words hit harder than Karen expected. That's not... I was trying to maintain standards. You were trying to control everything and everyone around you, just like you're doing now. Vivian stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. And you know what? People are getting tired of it. Really tired. What's that supposed to mean? It means that maybe this community would be better off without someone who threatens to cut off water supplies every time she doesn't get her way, Irini stared at her. Are you suggesting I should move? I'm suggesting that someone who can't be a good neighbor shouldn't be surprised when neighbors stop wanting them around. For a moment, Karen was speechless. The conversation had shifted from legal disputes to something much more personal and painful. I've lived in this community for 15 years, she said finally. I helped plan half the amenities you're trying to protect. I organized the fundraisers, ran the committees, mediated the disputes, and made sure everyone knew how indispensable you were. But here's the thing, Karen. Nobody is indispensable, especially not neighbors who sue their own community. Vivian turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving Karen standing alone in the hallway. The drive home was a blur of Denver traffic and swirling thoughts. Karen had expected the legal negotiation, had even expected continued hostility from Vivian. But she hadn't expected the conversation to cut so close to her deepest fears about herself and her place in the community. Was she really as controlling as Vivian suggested? Had her neighbors really been relieved when she stepped down as HOA president? The thought was more painful than she wanted to admit. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the for sale sign in the Hendersons' front yard as she turned onto her street. Then she saw another one 3 houses down, and another across the street. Karen parked in her driveway and walked over to Janet's house, where her neighbor was watering her flower beds. Janet, what's going on with all the for sale signs? Janet looked uncomfortable. People are worries. Karen woke up Friday morning to find her sprinkler system sputtering and her water pressure reduced to a trickle. She stood in her shower, watching the pathetic stream of water dribble from the shower head, and realized that the HOA's water supply problems had now extended to the municipal connections that fed the entire neighborhood. By the time she'd managed to rinse the shampoo from her hair, her phone was ringing. Mrs. Mitchell? This is Tom Bradley from Denver Water. We're getting reports of pressure issues in your neighborhood. Are you experiencing problems? Significant problems, Karen said, wrapping a towel around her wet hair. What's causing it? We're investigating, but it appears someone may have interfered with the secondary supply line that feeds your development. Do you know of any construction or utility work in the area? Karen looked out her bedroom window at the concrete dam. You might want to talk to the Willowbrook HOA about a structure they built across the natural creek. I suspect it's interfering with more than just the surface water flow. 3 hours later, Karen was sitting in the law office conference room again, but this time the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Vivian Vandenberg looked haggard, David Chen was shuffling through emergency court filings, and 2 new faces had joined the HOA side, an insurance adjuster and what appeared to be a crisis management consultant. Mrs. Mitchell, David Chen began, we need to discuss immediate solutions to the current water emergency. Water emergency? Rebecca Brennan asked. What are we talking about? The insurance adjuster, a nervous man in an ill-fitting suit, spoke up. The dam construction appears to have compromised underground utility lines. Half the neighborhood lost water pressure this morning, and Denver Water is threatening to red tag the entire development until the issue is resolved. Karen felt a mixture of vindication and concern. Red tag? Condemn the properties as uninhabitable due to inadequate water supply, the crisis consultant explained. We're looking at 200 families who might have to evacuate until water service is restored. And how long would that take? Rebecca asked. David Chen looked miserable. According to Denver Water's engineering assessment, removing the dam and restoring natural water flow could take several weeks. But there's no guarantee that will solve the underground line damage. What about temporary solutions? They've brought in water trucks for essential services, but that's not sustainable long term. The city won't lift the red tag order until permanent water pressure is restored. Karen leaned back in her chair, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Vivian's aesthetic improvement had escalated from an environmental violation to a full-scale infrastructure disaster. "What are you proposing?" she asked. Vivian finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Complete removal of the dam, full environmental restoration, and," she swallowed hard, "compensation for your damages and legal fees, and we formally acknowledge that any future alterations to the waterway require your written consent as the upstream property owner." Rebecca made notes on her legal pad. "What about the federal violations?" "We'll work with the EPA to develop a restoration plan that satisfies their requirements," David Chen said. "Mrs. Mitchell's complaint withdrawal would be contingent on successful completion of the restoration." Karen looked around the table at the faces of people who had been her adversaries just days earlier. They looked exhausted, defeated, and genuinely scared about the consequences of their decisions. "There's one more thing," she said. Everyone looked up expectantly. "I want a formal apology from the HOA board, acknowledging that they proceeded with this project without proper permits or consultation with affected property owners." Vivian's face flushed red. "A public apology?" "A written apology that becomes part of the HOA records and is distributed to all residents. People need to understand what actually happened here and why." "That's humiliating." "It's accurate," Karen interrupted, "and it might prevent future boards from making similar mistakes." The crisis consultant whispered something to Vivian, who nodded reluctantly. "Fine," Vivian said. "We agree to all terms." But as Rebecca began drafting the settlement agreement, Karen's phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Emergency community meeting tonight at 7 p.m., mandatory attendance, special assessment vote." Karen showed the message to Rebecca, who frowned. "Special assessment for what?" "Let me make a call," David Chen said, stepping out of the room. He returned 5 minutes later, looking even more worried. "There's been a development. Some residents are organizing to recall the entire board and install an emergency management committee." "On what grounds?" Rebecca asked. "Gross negligence leading to a community-wide infrastructure crisis. If they succeed, the new board could potentially void any settlement agreement we reach here today." Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her again. "Can they do that? Legally?" "It's complicated. A new board could argue that the previous board exceeded their authority in reaching a settlement. But practically," David shrugged, "it would be a mess that could drag on for years." The crisis consultant leaned forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, there may be a way to prevent this situation from spiraling further out of control." "I'm listening." "What if, instead of fighting with the community, you became part of the solution? The Emergency Management Committee is going to need someone with extensive HOA experience to navigate this crisis." Karen stared at him. "Are you suggesting I run for the emergency board?" "I'm suggesting that you might be the only person in this community with the legal knowledge, environmental expertise, and historical perspective to guide Willowbrook through this crisis." Rebecca looked skeptical. "That seems like a conflict of interest, given that Mrs. Mitchell is the injured party in this dispute. Or it could be the fastest path to resolution," the consultant countered. "Who better to oversee the dam removal and restoration than the person who understands both the legal requirements and the environmental issues?" Karen's mind was racing. The idea of returning to HOA leadership, especially under these circumstances, was both appealing and terrifying. She'd spent months feeling excluded and powerless. Now they were essentially offering her the chance to take control of the entire situation. "I'd need guarantees," she said slowly. "What kind of guarantees?" "First, immediate commencement of dam removal, regardless of any board changes. Second, full funding for environmental restoration from HOA reserves and insurance proceeds. Third, a formal policy preventing any future waterway alterations without environmental permits." "And fourth?" Vivian asked, apparently sensing there was more. Karen looked directly at Vivian. You resign from the board immediately and agree not to seek re-election for at least 2 years. The room fell silent. Vivian's face went through several shades of red before settling on pale gray. You can't be serious. You created this disaster through reckless decision-making and then tried to turn the community against me when I pointed out your mistakes. Why would I trust you to be part of the solution? We were trying to improve the community. You were trying to impose your aesthetic preferences without regard for law, environmental impact, or residents' rights. That's not improvement. It's vandalism. David Chen looked at his client. Vivian. Given the potential legal liability and insurance issues, Vivian stood up abruptly. Fine, I resign, but don't expect me to support your emergency board campaign. I don't expect your support, Karen replied evenly. I expect you to stay out of the way while competent people fix the mess you created. After Vivian left, the remaining negotiators spent another hour hammering out details. The settlement agreement would be contingent on Karen's successful election to the Emergency Management Board, but the dam removal would begin immediately, regardless of political outcomes. As Karen drove home through her neighborhood, she could see the evidence of the crisis everywhere: water trucks parked on street corners, residents carrying jugs and buckets, children playing in yards that were already showing signs of drought stress from the interrupted irrigation systems. This was her community. These were her neighbors. And like it or not, she was probably the only person with the knowledge and experience to guide them through this disaster. The community meeting that evening was standing room only. Karen arrived early and took a seat in the front row, directly facing the podium where a visibly nervous Bob Patterson was attempting to call the meeting to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to address the current water supply emergency and consider emergency management procedures. A man Karen didn't recognize stood up in the back. We're here because the current board screwed up so badly that our entire neighborhood might get condemned. Angry voices filled the room. People were standing up, shouting questions and accusations. Several residents were demanding immediate recall elections. Others wanted to know about their insurance coverage and legal liability. Bob banged his gavel repeatedly. Please, let's maintain order. Order? Shouted Mrs. Henderson from the third row. Half my neighbors are staying in hotels because they don't have running water. What order are you talking about? Karen stood up and walked to the podium. The room gradually quieted. May I address the community? Bob looked relieved. The floor recognizes Karen Mitchell. Karen turned to face her neighbors, people she'd worked with, argued with, and shared 15 years of community Ellie. 6 weeks later, Karen stood at her kitchen window, watching the creek flow freely through her backyard for the first time since this whole ordeal began. The concrete dam was gone, replaced by a carefully engineered restoration that included native plantings, erosion control, and a small educational plaque explaining the importance of natural waterways. The phone rang, interrupting her morning coffee ritual. Karen, it's Rebecca. I just got off a call with the EPA. They're officially closing the enforcement action. No fines, no penalties, and they're actually using the Willowbrook restoration as a case study for community-led environmental remediation. Karen smiled, watching a blue jay splash in the shallow pools near the creek bend. What about the insurance settlement? Final check cleared yesterday. Between the insurance proceeds and the special assessment, the community has enough to complete all restoration work and establish a reserve fund for future environmental compliance. After hanging up, Karen walked outside to check on the morning's progress. The construction crews had been working since dawn, installing the final sections of the educational walkway that would allow residents to appreciate the restored creek without damaging the delicate ecosystem they'd worked so hard to rebuild. Mrs. Mitchell? Karen turned to see a young woman with a clipboard and a Denver Post-Press badge. I'm Sarah Chen from the Environmental Beat. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the Willowbrook restoration project. Of course, though I should mention that this was very much a community effort, not a solo project. That's actually what makes it interesting. Most environmental disputes end up in years of litigation. This one went from crisis to resolution in less than 2 months. What made the difference? Karen considered the question while watching the construction crew carefully position native boulders to create natural pools and riffles in the creek bed. I think it was the community realizing that we all had more to gain from working together than from fighting each other. The crisis forced everyone to focus on practical solutions rather than who was right or wrong. But there must have been some tense moments. I heard there were protests, recall elections, threats of federal prosecution. There were definitely tense moments, Karen admitted, but ultimately, people want to protect their property values and their quality of life. Once everyone understood that following environmental law was the best way to do both, the path forward became clear. After the reporter left, Karen walked the length of the restoration project, from the spring source on her upstream property down to where the creek now flowed smoothly into the community's redesigned water features. The entire system was working better than it had before the dam was built. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bob Patterson. Board meeting at 4 p.m. Final budget review for the native plant installation. Karen checked her watch. She had time to stop by the community center and review the contractor bids before the meeting. Being emergency HOA president was turning out to be more time-consuming than her previous term, partly because of the restoration oversight, but mostly because the community was more engaged than she'd ever seen them. The crisis had awakened, something in Willowbrook Estates, a sense of collective responsibility that had been dormant during the years of routine maintenance and predictable committee meetings. Residents were attending board meetings, volunteering for restoration work, and actually reading the environmental compliance reports that Karen had made a standard part of the monthly newsletter. At the community center, Karen found an unexpected scene. Vivian Vandenberg was sitting in the lobby, looking uncomfortable but determined. Vivian, this is a surprise. I was hoping we could talk, privately. They found an empty meeting room, and Vivian closed the door behind them. I owe you an apology, Vivian said without preamble. A real one, not the legal settlement version. Karen waited. I was wrong about the dam project. I was wrong about the legal issues, and I was wrong about you. Vivian's voice was steady but strained. I let my personal issues with your leadership style cloud my judgment about what was best for the community. Personal issues? I moved here because I wanted to be part of a prestigious community, and I saw the HOA presidency as a way to establish myself socially. When you ran things, everything was so professional, competent. I felt like there wasn't room for someone like me to make a meaningful contribution. Karen felt an unexpected pang of recognition. Someone like you? Someone without your background, your experience, your confidence. I thought if I could just change enough things, modernize the community image, I could prove that I belonged here. Vivian, you didn't need to prove anything. Yes, I did. To myself, if nobody else. But I went about it all wrong. I endangered the community I was trying to improve. I violated laws I didn't bother to research, and I turned neighbors against each other over my own insecurities. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past 2 months settling between them. What will you do now? Karen asked. Bob Patterson offered me a position on the Environmental Compliance Committee. Apparently, my experience as a cautionary tale might be useful in helping future boards avoid similar mistakes. Karen almost smiled. That sounds like Bob's diplomatic way of saying you learned something valuable from this mess. I learned that good intentions don't excuse poor judgment, and that effective leadership requires humility, especially when you're dealing with issues you don't fully understand. Those are hard lessons. Expensive ones, too. My insurance covered most of the legal costs, but I'm still paying for the environmental assessment out of pocket. Vivian stood to leave, then paused. Karen, I have one more thing to ask you. What's that? The community needs continuity. The restoration project is going to require oversight for at least another year, and there are insurance issues and regulatory compliance requirements that need someone with your expertise. I hope you'll consider staying on as president when your emergency term expires. Karen was surprised by the request, and even more surprised by her own mixed feelings about it. 6 months ago, she'd been devastated by her election loss. Now, the prospect of continued HOA leadership felt both natural and daunting. "I'll think about it," she said. That evening, Karen sat on her back deck, listening to the sound of water flowing freely over the restored creek bed. The sound was different now, more musical, more alive than it had been before the dam was built. The restoration hadn't just returned the creek to its original state. It had improved on it. Janet appeared at the fence between their properties, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you might want some company for your celebration." "What are we celebrating?" "The EPA closure, the insurance settlement, the fact that you managed to turn a neighborhood disaster into something that actually improved our community." Janet handed Karen a glass. "Plus, I heard from a reliable source that you're being recruited for another presidential term. Word travels fast around here. It's a small community, which, by the way, is something that got lost in all the legal drama. We're neighbors first, political opponents second." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains while the creek bubbled peacefully below them. "Janet, can I ask you something? Was Vivian right about me being too controlling when I was president before?" Janet considered the question seriously. "You were thorough, maybe sometimes excessively thorough, but controlling? No, I don't think so. I think you cared deeply about doing things right, and sometimes that came across as inflexible. And now? Now you seem more collaborative, like you've learned to balance your expertise with other people's perspectives." Karen thought about the past 6 weeks. The community meetings where residents had contributed ideas for the restoration design, the collaborative approach to contractor selection, the way she'd incorporated input from the Environmental Compliance Committee and the landscape architecture volunteers. "Maybe I learned that being right isn't the same as being effective," she said. "And maybe the community learned that having someone who's willing to do the research and fight the hard battles is worth a little inflexibility." As they finished their wine, Karen realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with Willowbrook Estates. She was no longer fighting to prove her worth or defend her position. She was simply working to solve problems and serve the community's interests. The creek restoration had become a metaphor for her own restoration, not to what she'd been before, but to something better adapted to the current environment. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is David Patel from Riverside Estates. We heard about your success with environmental compliance and community management. Our HOA is facing some similar challenges. Would you be interested in consulting on water rights issues?" Karen stared at the message, realizing that her experience with the creek crisis had apparently created a reputation beyond Willowbrook. There might be other communities, other environmental disputes where her hard-won expertise could be valuable. But as she looked out at her restored creek, flowing peacefully through the community she'd helped save, Karen realized that some opportunities were worth more than others. She typed back, "Thank you for thinking of me, but I'm committed."